Imagine for a moment that you are a time traveler standing on the surface of our planet 3.5 billion years ago. You take a deep breath, expecting the familiar crisp scent of ocean salt and pine trees. Instead, your lungs instantly fill with a suffocating, dense mixture of methane, ammonia, and carbon dioxide. Your throat burns as if you have inhaled liquid fire. Your blood boils with toxic gases, your vision blurs, and within seconds you collapse onto the barren rocky ground, violently gasping for oxygen that simply does not exist. You die a rapid, agonizing death on the very planet you call home. This is the Archean Eon. This is the true face of the primordial Earth, a completely alien and hostile wasteland that would be utterly unrecognizable to any modern human. If you looked up at the sky in your final moments, you would not see a comforting canopy of pale blue. You would see a suffocating, heavy blanket of hazy orange smog so thick that the sun is reduced to a weak, sickly yellow smudge, struggling to pierce the chemical haze. The atmospheric pressure is crushing, bearing down on the jagged volcanic rocks with immense force. And then there are the oceans. There are no pristine blue waters crashing against white sandy beaches. The seas of the Archean Earth are a sickly, terrifying shade of olive green. They are saturated with massive amounts of dissolved iron, brewing under a toxic atmosphere, relentlessly battered by violent tidal waves generated by a moon that orbits much closer to the planet than it does today. The oceans are boiling cauldrons of chemical chaos, heated by a relentless barrage of asteroid impacts and a furiously active tectonic mantle that tears the seafloor apart. It is a world of absolute deafening silence, broken only by the deafening roar of volcanic eruptions, the cracking of tectonic plates, and the relentless howling of methane winds. There are no birds to sing, no leaves to rustle, no insects to buzz. The silence of the Archean Earth is the silence of an empty, uncaring cosmos. It is a planetary prison where the sheer violence of physics and chemistry reigns supreme. The universe is a cold, indifferent machine, and this young, chaotic Earth is just another meaningless rock floating in the endless dark void. The cosmos does not care if this planet burns, freezes, or shatters into a billion pieces. It simply exists, governed by blind, merciless physical laws that crush anything fragile enough to be caught in their path. Yet within this seemingly sterile and apocalyptic hellscape, an absolute miracle has already occurred. Deep beneath the surface of the violently churning green oceans, hidden away in the pitch-black abyss where the weak sunlight can never reach, the impossible has taken root. Clinging to the scalding mineral-rich chimneys of hydrothermal vents, a vast and invisible empire is silently thriving. These are the archaea, the very first architects of biological life. They are single-celled organisms, microscopic and incredibly primitive, yet they possess a resilience that is truly terrifying. They do not need the sun. They do not need calm seas. And most importantly, they absolutely do not need oxygen. To them, the toxic chemical soup that would instantly dissolve your lungs is the sweetest nectar. They feast on hydrogen sulfide, they consume methane, and they draw their vital energy directly from the radioactive, superheated breath of the Earth's molten core. They are the ultimate extremophiles, the undisputed masters of an incredibly hostile domain. For hundreds of millions of years, these anaerobic entities have ruled the planet without any challengers. They have multiplied, they have colonized every boiling volcanic fissure, and they have established a microscopic planetary dominance that makes the later reign of the dinosaurs look like a fleeting, insignificant moment in time. They are perfectly adapted to the nightmare. In their microscopic reality, the Archean Earth is a paradise of infinite resources. They have no predators, they have no concept of scarcity, and they are completely oblivious to the vast empty universe beyond their watery abyss. They are a testament to the stubborn, irrational willpower of life itself, a fragile biological rebellion against the crushing entropy of the universe. The cosmic void throws asteroids at them. The tectonic plates crush their habitats. The radiation sterilizes the upper waters, but the anaerobic empire always endures, multiplying in the dark, silent, and unstoppable. Try to comprehend the sheer scale of this microscopic kingdom. We are not talking about thousands or millions of creatures. We are talking about numbers that defy human imagination. A biological biomass so dense and so vast that it literally altered the chemical composition of the planet's crust. Generation after generation, for over 1 billion years, they lived, they reproduced, and they died in absolute darkness. 1 billion years is an incomprehensible stretch of time. Entire mountain ranges rose from the mantle and were ground down into dust by the relentless methane winds. Supercontinents smashed together and ripped themselves apart, all while this invisible empire continued its silent reign below the waves. They were the ultimate survivors, the undisputed champions of the Archean world. They had solved the puzzle of existence in a universe that actively tried to destroy them at every turn. But this evolutionary triumph contained a fatal flaw. Their entire existence, their entire biological machinery was fundamentally dependent on the absolute absence of one specific element. An element that is so common in the universe, yet so highly reactive that its sudden introduction would be the equivalent of dropping a nuclear bomb into their fragile chemical ecosystem. They were sitting on a planetary powder keg, completely blind to the fuse that was slowly burning in the shallow waters above them. They have conquered the abyss, and they believe in their biological simplicity that this is the eternal state of existence. They are the blind, unthinking lords of a toxic world, completely unaware that their perfect, unchanging paradise is standing on the precipice of the most catastrophic biological upheaval in the history of the cosmos. The universe, in its infinite cruelty, does not allow any empire to last forever. The rules of survival are about to be brutally rewritten, not by a massive asteroid falling from the sky, not by a sudden shift in the tectonic plates, but by a microscopic glitch in the code of life itself. A silent, imperceptible mutation is brewing in the shallow, sunlit margins of the global ocean, an evolutionary spark that will ignite a planetary inferno. If you survive the toxic air, if you survive the boiling green seas, you might think you understand the harshness of this world. I always thought that a giant rock from space wiping out the dinosaurs was the most terrifying event in planetary history. But the reality that followed was infinitely more horrifying, because the first true weapon of mass destruction was not forged in the vacuum of space. It was born from the very essence of life, and it was about to unleash an apocalypse that would make a meteor impact look like a merciful end. Fast forward through the abyss of geological time. Let us leave the boiling pitch-black hydrothermal vents of the deep Archean Ocean and travel upward toward the hostile surface. Here, in the shallow sun-drenched coastal margins of the early continents, the waters are still a sickly green, and the atmosphere remains a crushing blanket of toxic smog. But a subtle, almost imperceptible shift has occurred. A microscopic anomaly, a random error in the genetic code of a single insignificant bacterial cell, has just rewritten the destiny of the entire planet. This tiny entity, a pioneer known to us as cyanobacteria, has achieved something that borders on the miraculous. It has figured out how to hack the universe. For billions of years, the ultimate source of energy in our solar system, the sun, had been blasting the Earth with relentless, unyielding radiation. It was a one-way street of cosmic fury, bombarding the barren rocks and boiling the lifeless surface. But this microscopic mutant, this tiny speck of biological matter, evolved a microscopic quantum machine inside its own cellular structure. It developed the ability to capture those incoming solar photons, harness their violent energy, and use it to literally tear apart water molecules. This is the birth of photosynthesis. Today we think of photosynthesis as a gentle, peaceful process that paints our world green. But in the brutal context of the Archean eon, it was a profound act of planetary rebellion. The cyanobacteria had successfully weaponized sunlight. They no longer had to scavenge for rare chemical nutrients near the boiling vents of the deep abyss. They had tapped into an infinite, inexhaustible power source that shone down upon them every single day. This evolutionary leap gave them an absolute unstoppable advantage. They began to multiply at a terrifying rate, forming vast, slimy mats of green bacteria along the shallow coastlines, greedily drinking the sunlight and consuming the endless oceans of water around them. They were building a new biological empire, expanding across the globe with a ruthless, silent efficiency. Yet this magnificent triumph of biological engineering contained a dark, horrifying secret. The universe is governed by the strict laws of thermodynamics, and every chemical reaction has a consequence. When the cyanobacteria used solar energy to violently split the water molecule, they extracted the hydrogen they needed for food, but they were left with a highly reactive, incredibly dangerous waste product. They had to expel this waste out of their cells to survive. And that waste product was a pair of bonded oxygen atoms. We call it molecular oxygen, or simply O2. To us humans of the 21st century, oxygen is the very essence of life. It is the invisible force that fuels our brains, powers our muscles, and keeps our civilization running. But to the inhabitants of the primitive Earth, to the vast, unchallenged empire of anaerobic bacteria that had ruled the planet for over 1 billion years, oxygen was the ultimate poison. It was a molecular monster. Oxygen is an electron thief. It is a highly aggressive, volatile element that desperately wants to bond with other molecules, tearing their fragile chemical structures apart in the process. If you were an anaerobic organism perfectly adapted to a world of methane and hydrogen sulfide exposure, to even a tiny microscopic bubble of oxygen would be an instant agonizing death sentence. It would instantly strip the electrons from your cell membranes, ripping your biological machinery to shreds at the molecular level. It would be exactly like bathing in concentrated sulfuric acid or being exposed to lethal doses of ionizing radiation. Oxygen was an invisible corrosive fire that burned cellular structures from the inside out. The cyanobacteria, in their mindless mechanical drive to survive and multiply, had accidentally invented the most toxic, destructive substance the Earth had ever seen. And they were pumping it directly into the water, constantly, relentlessly, with every single photon of sunlight they consumed. Imagine the sheer terrifying scale of this cosmic irony. A tiny unthinking cell driven only by the blind algorithms of evolution now held more destructive potential than any asteroid impact or supervolcano eruption in the history of the solar system. The cosmos did not care about the delicate balance of the Archean ecosystem. The physical laws of chemistry simply dictated that the oxygen must be released, and so it was released. The cosmos watched with dead, unblinking eyes as the biological balance of an entire world was fundamentally shattered. There is a profound, chilling terror in realizing that our human existence, our very ability to think and breathe today, is built entirely upon the greatest act of unintentional chemical warfare in planetary history. We are the direct descendants of a global poisoning event. A thin, unassuming green slime clung to the shallow rocks, silently releasing billions upon billions of tiny transparent bubbles under the weak yellow sun. Each of those microscopic bubbles was a microscopic bomb, a payload of pure concentrated toxicity slowly drifting up into the water column. The cyanobacteria were completely ignorant of the apocalyptic horror they were unleashing upon the global ocean. They were just surviving, just breathing out their waste. They did not possess brains or malice or any concept of the catastrophic domino effect they had just triggered. They simply existed, and in their existence, they were slowly, steadily poisoning the entire world. This is the chilling reality of nature, a stark reminder of our own fragility in a universe of violent forces. The most profound world-shattering catastrophes do not always announce themselves with the deafening roar of a colliding planet or the fiery explosion of a dying star. Sometimes the end of the world begins with a silent, invisible exhalation from a microscopic organism. The anaerobic empire, sleeping peacefully in the dark depths below, had no warning system at all. They had absolutely no evolutionary defense against this alien chemical weapon. The cosmic scales had tipped irrevocably. The era of the deep-sea lords was slowly drawing to a close, and the architects of their absolute doom were merely basking in the sunlight, unaware of their own terrifying power. That was an unprecedented biological leap, a true miracle of quantum mechanics harnessed by living matter. But the cyanobacteria did not know that their very first breath was the most ruthless death sentence for 99% of all life on Earth. Let us plunge back into the sickly green depths of the Archean Ocean. You might assume that the moment these microscopic cyanobacteria began exhaling oxygen, the world immediately choked. You might picture a sudden violent bubbling of toxic gas turning the atmosphere into a lethal chamber overnight. But the universe operates on scales of time and chemistry that mock human intuition. For hundreds of millions of years, the lethal oxygen produced by these sun-eating mutants never even reached the surface. Not a single molecule of this corrosive gas managed to escape into the thick orange methane sky. Instead, an invisible, silent war of planetary proportions was being waged beneath the waves. It was a chemical arms race between the relentless biological engine of life and the immense inanimate mineral reserves of the Earth itself. The Archean Ocean was not just a body of water, it was a vast, highly saturated chemical soup. The reason the water was that terrifying shade of olive green was due to the unimaginable quantities of dissolved, unoxidized iron suspended within it. For a billion years, underwater volcanoes and deep-sea hydrothermal vents had been vomiting endless megatons of iron into the global ocean. In a world without oxygen, this iron simply dissolved, floating freely in the dark currents, creating a metallic ocean that stretched across the entire globe. This dissolved iron became the unintentional savior of the anaerobic empire. It acted as a colossal planetary-scale chemical shield. Every time a cyanobacterium floating in the sunlit shallows exhaled a microscopic bubble of toxic oxygen, that oxygen did not travel far. Almost immediately, it violently collided with the dissolved iron in the water. The chemical reaction was instantaneous and ruthless. The oxygen, hungry for electrons, bonded fiercely with the iron. It was the process of oxidation. In simple terms, the ocean was rusting from the inside out. This reaction neutralized the toxic oxygen instantly, transforming it from a lethal free-roaming gas into a heavy, inert solid particle of iron oxide, rust. The deadly biological weapon was disarmed the moment it was deployed, neutralized by the sheer overwhelming mass of the planet's geology. The anaerobic bacteria living their dark, oblivious lives in the deep trenches felt absolutely nothing. The chemical shield of the ocean was taking the hits for them, absorbing the toxic fallout of the surface world. They continued to multiply. They continued to rule entirely blind to the apocalyptic barrage of oxygen being fired from above. But there is a terrifying, inescapable mathematical reality to this silent war. The iron dissolved in the ocean, no matter how vast, was a finite resource. It had a physical limit. The cyanobacteria, on the other hand, had tapped into an infinite power source. As long as the sun continued to burn and the oceans contained water, they would continue to multiply and exhale their toxic breath. The scales of this cosmic battle were inevitably tipped toward biological runaway. Imagine the sheer terrifying duration of this unseen conflict. It did not last for a century or a millennium or even a million years. This silent rusting of the oceans dragged on for hundreds of millions of years. Generation after generation of cyanobacteria lived, reproduced, and died relentlessly, pumping trillions of tons of oxygen into the sea. And generation after generation, the iron shield silently absorbed the blow. The visual spectacle of this era, if human eyes could have witnessed it, would have been profoundly haunting. As the oxygen bonded with the iron, the microscopic particles of rust grew heavy. They could no longer float in the currents. They began to sink. Slowly, relentlessly, a ceaseless blizzard of blood, red rust snow began to fall through the water column. Trillions of microscopic red flakes drifted down from the sunlit shallows, sinking through the sickly green waters, descending into the pitch-black abyss where the anaerobic empire thrived. It was a silent, beautiful, and utterly terrifying rain of oxidized metal. Over millions of years, this red snow accumulated on the ocean floor, layer upon layer, compressing under the immense pressure of the water to form thick bands of solid iron ore. These are the banded iron formations. When you look at the steel beams of a modern skyscraper or the chassis of the car you drive, you are looking at the direct physical remnants of this ancient, silent war. You are looking at the rusted blood of the Archean Ocean, the fossilized evidence of the Earth desperately trying to defend itself against the very first biological weapon. This is the profound, chilling terror of nature. A planetary catastrophe does not always announce itself with a deafening roar or a blinding flash of light. The most absolute destruction can arrive with agonizing slowness. It can be a creeping silent corrosion, an invisible tipping of the scales that stretches out over eons. The anaerobic empire was being pushed toward the precipice of extinction, not by a sudden disaster, but by a mathematical certainty, a slow depletion of their chemical armor. They had no nervous systems to feel fear, no eyes to see the red snow falling around them, and no brains to comprehend that their world was fundamentally changing. They were trapped in a biological dead end, hostage to the blind, unfeeling laws of chemistry. Every falling flake of rust was a countdown timer, ticking away the remaining lifespan of their empire. The cyanobacteria were entirely ignorant. The deep-sea bacteria were entirely oblivious, and the universe watched with cold, silent indifference as the planetary shield slowly eroded away. The surface of the ocean remained calm, but beneath a massive chemical reaction was draining Earth's last line of defense. When this shield shattered, the real nightmare began. The immense chemical shield of the Archean Ocean was not infinite. After hundreds of millions of years of relentlessly absorbing the toxic microscopic breaths of the cyanobacteria, the dissolved iron finally ran out. The great rusting of the Earth came to an end. Down in the absolute darkness of the ocean floor, the endless blizzard of red rust slowly ceased falling. The massive compressed layers of banded iron formations were complete, sealing away trillions of tons of oxidized metal into the geological record entirely forgotten by the biological world above. But the biological engines of the cyanobacteria did not stop. They never stopped. Driven by the mindless algorithms of survival and reproduction, they continued to bask in the shallow, sunlit waters. They continued to brutally split water molecules, continued to harvest the solar radiation, and continued to pump out their lethal, highly reactive waste. With the planetary iron shield finally depleted, there was absolutely nothing left to absorb the poison. The oxygen began to heavily saturate the water, dissolving directly into the ocean currents, building up a terrifying, invisible pressure. This was the catastrophic tipping point. The water itself began to undergo a horrifying transformation. For over 1 billion years, the oceans had been a thick, murky, and violent shade of olive green. Now completely stripped of their iron content and saturated with invisible corrosive oxygen gas, the waters began to clear. They slowly transitioned into a crystal pristine and entirely alien shade of blue. To modern human eyes, this would look like a beautiful purification, a stunning cleansing of the primordial seas. But in the ruthless, brutal reality of the Archean era, this beautiful blue was the absolute color of chemical saturation. It was the color of a loaded planetary weapon primed and ready to detonate. The toxic gas built up relentless pressure, filling the upper layers of the global ocean until the water simply could not hold a single molecule more. And then the ultimate terrifying breach of containment occurred. The oxygen began to bubble out of the water. It forcefully broke through the surface tension of the waves, escaping the liquid realm and ascending directly into the thick, choking orange atmosphere of the early Earth. The ultimate biological weapon had broken out of its watery laboratory. It was now loose in the skies, completely unchained. What happened next was an invisible planetary-scale massacre in the upper atmosphere, a chemical war that would forever alter the destiny of the globe. The Archean sky was an incredibly heavy blanket of methane gas. Methane is a fiercely potent greenhouse gas. At that specific time in history, the sun was much younger and significantly weaker than it is today, radiating far less heat into the cold solar system. It was this thick, suffocating methane blanket that aggressively trapped the planet's internal volcanic heat in the weak solar radiation. This atmospheric shield was the only mechanism keeping the oceans liquid and preventing the Earth from instantly becoming a frozen dead rock in the absolute zero of the cosmic void. The methane was the fragile barrier standing between the living world and the merciless, freezing apathy of the universe. But oxygen is the sworn, uncompromising chemical enemy of methane. When these two gases met in the high atmosphere, a violent invisible combustion immediately erupted. The highly reactive oxygen molecules began to systematically hunt down and tear apart the methane molecules in a merciless molecular slaughter. The oxygen viciously ripped the carbon and hydrogen atoms away from each other, violently reassembling them into carbon dioxide and water vapor. Carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas, but it is vastly weaker, a pathetic shadow compared to the heat-trapping power of methane. The planet's thermal shield was being actively dissolved, eaten away bite by the sheer overwhelming volume of toxic biological waste relentlessly rising from the oceans below. The visual transformation of the sky during this era would have been a terrifying spectacle of cosmic destruction. The heavy, suffocating orange smog that had comfortably shrouded the world since its violent, fiery birth began to thin out, visibly dissipating into nothingness. The sickly, yellow smudge of the sun grew brighter, harsher, and more piercing at a glaring eye staring down at a ruined world. The sky was literally being torn open, stripping away the planetary armor and revealing the terrifying, endless black void of the universe beyond. As the methane was aggressively consumed, the familiar orange hue faded away entirely, replaced by a pale, ghostly, and incredibly unfamiliar shade of blue. The blue sky as we know and love it today was born not from a peaceful, harmonious evolution, but from the incredibly violent destruction of an ancient life-sustaining atmospheric shield. The anaerobic empire hiding in the deep, warm waters was completely blind to this apocalyptic celestial war raging miles above their heads. They could not see the blue sky. They could not comprehend the rapidly shifting chemistry, and they could not fathom that their warm planetary incubator was being systematically dismantled by an invisible, odorless gas. They were entirely at the mercy of a universe that simply does not care about survival, a cold cosmos that only obeys the blind, uncaring, and rigid laws of thermodynamics and chemical reactions. The cyanobacteria, in their blind quest for solar energy, had inadvertently triggered a planetary chain reaction that could no longer be stopped by any force on Earth. They had successfully consumed the sun, they had utterly poisoned the oceans, and now they had successfully shattered the sky itself. As the methane blanket rapidly vanished, the planet's precious life-giving heat began to bleed out uncontrollably into the infinite, freezing dark of space. The cosmic void is profoundly unforgiving, a realm of unimaginable, crushing cold that aggressively steals warmth from anything it touches. Without its protective smog, the Earth was left totally exposed, naked, and incredibly vulnerable. The temperature of the global atmosphere began to sharply plummet. The warm, violent winds of the Archean world began to chill rapidly, transforming into biting, freezing gales that swept ruthlessly across the barren, rocky continents. The ocean surface began to rapidly lose its heat to the cold air, the water turning frigid and deeply hostile. The biological weapon of oxygen had not only poisoned the air, it had fundamentally destroyed the planet's entire heating system. The orange sky is being torn apart. Oxygen, the sworn enemy of methane, begins its massacre in the stratosphere. And what falls down is not rain, but the bone-chilling cold of death. Life had accidentally pressed the self-destruct button. Ice began to spread from the poles, ruthlessly squeezing the equator. The Earth was no longer a vibrant, living planet. It became a colossal, silent ice tomb drifting aimlessly in an ignorant, uncaring universe. The great atmospheric slaughter of methane was complete, and the catastrophic consequences were now crashing down upon the physical world. Without its thick, insulating blanket of greenhouse gases, the planet was left utterly naked against the absolute zero temperature of the cosmic void. The heat that had sustained the boiling oceans and incubated the vast biological empires was rapidly bleeding out into the endless dark vacuum of space. The young sun, still relatively weak in its stellar life cycle, could not provide enough radiant energy to compensate for this catastrophic thermal collapse. The global temperature began to plummet with terrifying speed, dropping to an unfathomable -50 degrees Celsius across the entire surface. This was not a mere winter. This was the onset of a planetary deep freeze, a relentless meteorological nightmare that would completely redefine the concept of survival. The freezing process did not happen overnight, but in geological terms, it was a sudden, violent shock to the system. It began at the poles where the sun's rays were the weakest. The water molecules, robbed of their thermal energy, slowed down and locked together into rigid crystalline structures. Thin sheets of ice formed on the surface of the violently churning oceans, rapidly growing thicker, heavier, and more expansive with every passing year. These polar ice caps became gargantuan, creeping monsters of solid water. Driven by the relentless drop in global temperatures, massive glaciers began to crawl outward from the highest latitudes, mercilessly grinding down the barren, continental rocks and swallowing everything in their path. The creeping frost was an unstoppable, unfeeling geological force. But the true horror of this freezing event lay in a merciless law of planetary physics known as the albedo effect. As the brilliant white ice sheets expanded their territory, they acted like colossal mirrors, aggressively reflecting the already weak incoming solar radiation right back into space. The more the ice spread, the more sunlight was rejected, and the colder the planet became. It was a runaway, self-amplifying loop of catastrophic cooling. The Earth had entered a death spiral of its own making. The freezing fronts marched relentlessly toward the equator. From both hemispheres, a slow-motion pincer movement that squeezed the remaining liquid oceans into an ever-shrinking band of desperate warmth. Finally, the two creeping fronts of ice met at the equator. The last open waters froze solid. The planetary seal was complete. The oceans, once boiling cauldrons of chemical chaos, were now entombed beneath a solid shell of ice that was kilometers thick. This was the birth of the Huronian glaciation, the very first and arguably the most devastating snowball Earth event in the history of our solar system. The planet had transformed into a blinding white, perfectly silent sphere of ice, indistinguishable from a dead, frozen moon drifting in the outer darkness. The roaring winds of the Archean era were replaced by a deafening, absolute stillness. The crashing tidal waves were frozen mid-swell, permanently locked in a rigid, icy grave. The Earth had become a sterile, white mausoleum, a monument to the disastrous consequences of unchecked biological expansion. This frozen hellscape was not a temporary phase. It was a planetary sentence that lasted for an incomprehensible 300 million years. Imagine an abyss of time so vast that entire species could have evolved and died out thousands of times over. Yet the Earth remained locked in exactly the same frozen silent state. Within this icy prison, a profound and cruel paradox of evolution was playing out. The cyanobacteria, the brilliant architects of photosynthesis, had conquered the world. They had successfully weaponized the sun, they had multiplied to unimaginable numbers, and they had fundamentally altered the chemical composition of the atmosphere to suit their relentless biological engine. But in doing so, they had triggered a giant planetary cooling machine that nearly froze them to death. Their ultimate glowing triumph had instantly mutated into their ultimate horrifying punishment. They were trapped in a prison made of their own frozen water, suffocating under a thick layer of ice that completely blocked out the very sunlight they needed to survive. The cosmic ironies do not get more brutal than this. The biological entity that brought light and energy to the world had plunged that same world into the deepest, coldest darkness imaginable. This is the terrifying reality of existence in a universe governed by blind physical laws. The cosmos does not reward success, and it does not forgive mistakes. It only calculates the thermodynamic equations. When a biological species blindly consumes resources and recklessly alters its environment, the universe simply responds with an equal and opposite physical reaction. The cyanobacteria were learning the hardest lesson of existence, a lesson written in solid ice and freezing temperatures. The brightest rise leads to the worst self-destruction. There are no exceptions in the universe, and there is absolutely nowhere to hide when the planet itself turns against you. The tiny fragile flame of life which had fought so hard to ignite in the boiling toxic seas of the Archean was now flickering dangerously low, buried under millions of tons of crushing, unyielding ice. Imagine the sheer psychological terror of this frozen reality. If you could stand on the surface of this snowball Earth, you would be utterly crushed by the absolute absence of sensory input. The blinding white ice stretches endlessly in every direction, meeting the pale alien blue sky at a razor-sharp horizon. The weak sun hangs low, a useless, freezing disk of light that provides no comfort, no warmth, and no hope. There is no weather, no rain, no changing of the seasons. There is only an eternal, unchanging, bone-shattering cold. The silence is so absolute, so profound, that it would literally drive a human mind to madness. It is the silence of an empty tomb, the silence of a planet that has given up the fight. Beneath your feet, locked under thousands of meters of solid crushing ice, the oceans have become dark, stagnant, and suffocatingly cold. The cyanobacteria, once the undisputed arrogant rulers of the sunlit shallows, are now desperately clinging to the microscopic fractures in the ice, trapped in tiny hypersaline pockets of liquid water that refuse to freeze. They are starving for sunlight, their biological engines sputtering and dying in the suffocating darkness. They are experiencing the horrific, slow agony of a self-inflicted extinction. They built an empire on oxygen, and the universe paid them back in solid ice. The sheer overwhelming arrogance of biology, the blind assumption that life can endlessly conquer and manipulate its environment without consequence, was violently shattered against the unyielding laws of thermodynamics. The universe is a vast, unthinking machine, and the Earth is just a tiny, fragile cog caught in its gears. When the biological entities disrupted the atmospheric balance, the machine simply reset itself to a lower energy state. The universe did not punish the cyanobacteria out of malice. It simply let them suffer the physical consequences of their own extraordinary success. This is the ultimate existential terror. We are not fighting against evil monsters or malicious alien invaders. We are fighting against the cold dead and incredibly precise equations of chemistry and physics. The forces that govern the cosmos are entirely deaf to our suffering, completely blind to our struggles, and absolutely indifferent to our survival. The snowball Earth was a monumental silent testament to the extreme fragility of life, a terrifying reminder that the line between a thriving biosphere and a dead frozen wasteland is incredibly thin. The anaerobic empire, the ancient kings of the deep, were also trapped in this icy nightmare. The hydrothermal vents, their last remaining sanctuaries, were slowly being choked off by the massive shifts in tectonic pressure caused by the weight of the global ice sheets. The planet was dying from the outside in and from the inside out. The biological experiment of Earth seemed to have reached its catastrophic conclusion. The extinction of the dinosaurs left behind magnificent fossils for us to marvel at. We can hold their massive skulls in our hands and feel the terrifying reality of their sudden demise. But this ancient catastrophe, the Great Oxidation Event, completely wiped out an estimated 99% of all living entities on the planet without leaving behind a single shattered bone. I always thought that a giant rock falling from the sky was the most terrifying way for a world to end. But the invisible reality of this microscopic massacre proves something far more sinister. Biology itself, when left unchecked, is the absolute perfect killer. While the surface of the Earth was violently crushed under the unyielding grip of the Huronian glaciation, an even more merciless extermination was taking place in the shrinking hypersaline pockets of liquid water beneath the ice. The anaerobic empire, the absolute masters of the planet for over 1 billion years, was being subjected to a systematic planetary-scale chemical execution. They were facing a two-front war against the fundamental forces of the universe, and they were losing on both sides. From above, the crushing, paralyzing cold of the snowball Earth was dramatically slowing down their metabolic engines, freezing their internal fluids, and tearing their fragile cellular walls apart with jagged ice crystals. But the true horror, the inescapable nightmare, was the invisible poison dissolving in the water around them. Oxygen had fully saturated the oceans. To the anaerobic bacteria, this newly abundant gas was not a breath of fresh air. It was a highly corrosive burning acid that relentlessly hunted them down in the dark. Imagine the sheer, unimaginable terror of their microscopic reality. If we could zoom in with an impossible cosmic lens to witness this invisible slaughter, we would see a battlefield of pure biological agony. As a tiny lethal bubble of oxygen came into contact with an anaerobic cell, the chemical reaction was violently instantaneous. The oxygen molecules, desperate for electrons, acted like microscopic chainsaws, ruthlessly ripping through the protective lipid membranes of the bacteria. The delicate internal machinery of the cell, perfectly evolved over a billion years to function in a toxic methane soup, was instantly set on fire by this aggressive chemical invader. The bacteria literally burned from the inside out, their cellular fluids boiling, their genetic code unraveling, and their microscopic bodies dissolving into nothingness. They writhed and ruptured in absolute silence, billions upon billions of them, dying every single second, completely unable to fight back against a predator they could not even perceive. This was not a war of predator and prey. This was an extermination event driven by cold, unfeeling chemistry. The universe does not possess a moral compass. It does not recognize the value of a billion-year biological dynasty. When the chemical equation of the oceans changed, the existing biological variables were simply efficiently and ruthlessly erased from the cosmic ledger. The sheer meaninglessness of this struggle is enough to induce a profound existential dread in any thinking mind. Countless trillions of organisms representing thousands of unique evolutionary pathways fought desperately for survival in the boiling Archean seas. They adapted, they thrived, they conquered their hostile environment, only to have their entire lineage instantly vaporized by a random mutation in a completely different species. All their evolutionary struggles, all their microscopic triumphs amounted to absolutely nothing in the face of a slight shift in atmospheric chemistry. The universe simply swept them away like dust from a cosmic table without a single moment of hesitation or regret. Those that did not immediately burn in the oxygen fire or freeze in the glacial ice were forced into a humiliating permanent exile. The former lords of the earth were violently driven out of the oceans and the sunlit shallows. They had to flee deep into the darkest, most hostile crevices of the planet. They retreated into the boiling hydrothermal vents of the deep-sea trenches where the intense volcanic heat kept the oxygen at bay. They burrowed deep into the subterranean crust, hiding in the microscopic pores of solid rock miles beneath the surface. They plunged into thick, suffocating mud and stagnant, anoxic swamps. They became the ultimate fugitives on their own home planet, permanently banished to the extreme hidden corners of the world. They went from being the absolute rulers of a global empire to pathetic, forgotten refugees hiding from the very air that now blanketed the earth. Even today, billions of years later, their descendants still hide in our deep oceans, in our muddy swamps, and even deep within our own human digestive tracts, forever terrified of the toxic oxygen that surrounds them. They are the living ghosts of a forgotten epoch, a permanent reminder of the great oxidation event. The Earth had been radically cleansed, completely sterilized by the dual forces of oxygen and ice. The cyanobacteria, the perpetrators of this global genocide, were also heavily decimated by the freezing consequences of their own actions. The planet had become a silent, frozen graveyard, a testament to the devastating power of biological recklessness. The evolutionary slate had been wiped almost entirely clean. The vast, diverse tapestry of anaerobic life was reduced to a few isolated, terrified threads. The cosmos had hit the reset button on the entire biosphere. But the universe is a place of endless, horrifying paradoxes. Just as the oxygen had acted as the ultimate executioner, bringing death and freezing ruin to the entire world, it was also secretly laying the foundations for an unimaginable biological resurrection. The poison that had sterilized the Archean Earth was about to become the most powerful evolutionary fuel the universe had ever seen. The few survivors that clung to life in the frozen toxic ruins were about to face a terrifying choice. They could either remain in the dark, hiding forever from the lethal gas, or they could do the absolutely unthinkable. They could turn around, face the microscopic monster that had destroyed their world, and find a way to consume the very fire that was burning them alive. The stage was set for the most dangerous and magnificent evolutionary gamble in the history of the cosmos. In the absolute darkest depths of despair, an anomalous miracle occurred. Life decided to swallow the very fire that was burning it alive, and from that terrifying union, a candle burning brighter than ever before was lit in the darkness. As the Huronian glaciation eventually retreated, driven by a slow resurgence of volcanic carbon dioxide over eons, the oceans were no longer the safe, stagnant green havens they once were. They were now fully oxygenated, a lethal corrosive bath that continued to hunt down the remaining anaerobic survivors. But within this toxic post-apocalyptic wasteland, a microscopic rebellion was quietly brewing. It was not a rebellion of numbers, but a rebellion of pure, unprecedented biological audacity. A tiny, seemingly insignificant fraction of the bacterial population had stumbled upon an evolutionary loophole that defied all logic. Instead of desperately fleeing from the oxygen, like the rest of their ancient brethren, they had begun to adapt to it. They had evolved a specialized, highly complex set of internal enzymes that could actually disarm the aggressive oxygen molecules. But they did not just neutralize the poison, they did something far more terrifying and brilliant. They harnessed it. They discovered that oxygen, because of its fierce desire to bond and tear things apart, was an incredibly potent chemical fuel. When controlled properly, the destructive power of oxygen could be channeled to break down food molecules with a violent efficiency that the old anaerobic world could never even dream of. This was the birth of aerobic respiration. It was the biological equivalent of taming a raging wildfire and using it to power a microscopic steam engine. These new oxygen-breathing bacteria had a massive, overwhelming energy advantage over everything else on the dying planet. They were tiny biological combustion engines burning the toxic waste of the cyanobacteria to generate unprecedented levels of internal power. Yet the true miracle, the singular event that would eventually lead to the existence of every plant, animal, and human being on Earth had not yet happened. It occurred during a microscopic encounter, so bizarre, so statistically improbable, that biologists still marvel at its terrifying implications. In the microscopic battlefield of the ancient ocean, organisms routinely consumed each other to survive. One day, a larger predatory archaeal cell, a survivor of the old anaerobic empire, encountered one of these new, highly efficient, oxygen-breathing bacteria. Driven by mindless hunger, the larger cell enveloped the smaller one, swallowing it whole. In the normal course of nature, the smaller cell would have been immediately dissolved, digested, and turned into basic nutrients. But the universe is governed by chaos and random chance. For some inexplicable reason, the digestion process failed. The smaller oxygen-breathing bacteria survived inside the belly of the beast. It was trapped within the larger cell, completely engulfed, yet still alive. What followed was not a parasitic infection, but the most profound and successful hostile takeover in the history of life. The two completely alien entities, locked together in a microscopic prison, struck an involuntary, desperate bargain for survival. The larger host cell provided a safe, protective environment, shielding the smaller bacteria from the harsh external world. In return, the smaller engulfed bacteria did what it did best. It consumed the toxic oxygen that was seeping into the host cell and used it to generate massive amounts of metabolic energy, leaking the excess power directly into the host. It was a perfect, terrifying symbiosis. The smaller bacteria ceased to be an independent organism. It became an internal organelle, a biological power plant permanently installed inside the larger cell. We call this tiny captive reactor a mitochondrion. Every single complex cell on Earth today, including the billions of cells that make up your brain, your heart, and your muscles, contains the direct, unbroken descendants of that original engulfed bacteria. They are still there, deep inside you, burning oxygen and generating the electrical currents that allow you to think, to feel, and to exist. This is the origin of the eukaryote, the complex cell that possesses a true nucleus and internal organs. When you take a deep breath, the oxygen rushing into your lungs is not just keeping you alive. It is feeding a trillion ancient microscopic captives that your biological ancestors swallowed billions of years ago. There is a profound, chilling horror hidden within this magnificent evolutionary triumph. The sheer complexity of human life, the towering intellect that allows us to ponder the cosmos, the emotional depth that allows us to love and to fear, is entirely built upon a foundation of absolute planetary-scale destruction. We exist solely because 99% of all life on Earth was mercilessly eradicated by a toxic gas. We breathe the poison that murdered our ancient ancestors. We are the ultimate beneficiaries of the greatest mass extinction in the history of the world. The universe does not care about justice, and it does not care about the trillions of organisms that died screaming in the dark. It only rewards the survivors, no matter how brutal, bizarre, or accidental their survival might be. The eukaryotic cell was a biological monster, a chimera born from the ashes of a poisoned world, and it was now equipped with a nuclear reactor that allowed it to conquer the entire planet. Armed with this incredible new energy source, the eukaryotic cells began to grow larger, to move faster, and to experiment with entirely new forms of biological architecture. They began to clump together, forming the very first multicellular organisms. They built complex tissues, specialized organs, and nervous systems. They crawled out of the oceans, they conquered the continents, and they eventually looked up at the stars. But none of this would have been possible without the Great Oxidation Event. The catastrophe that nearly sterilized the Earth was the exact same mechanism that forged the tools required for complex life. It is an existential paradox that forces us to question the very nature of existence. Does the universe require mass death to produce higher intelligence? Are we just the accidental byproduct of a chemical war between microscopic entities that had no idea what they were doing? The reality is that we are not the masters of this planet. We are just the current temporary occupants of a biological lineage that survived a cosmic game of Russian roulette. The eukaryotes had won the ultimate lottery, rising from the frozen, rusted ruins of the Archean Earth to inherit a brand new oxygenated world. But the relentless cycle of nature is never truly finished. The cosmic machine was already winding up for the next great test, and the descendants of these microscopic chimeras would soon face terrors that would make the oxygen crisis look like a gentle prologue. Take a deep breath. Feel the air rush into your lungs, oxygenating your blood, fueling the complex neural networks in your brain that allow you to understand these very words. That breath you just took is a direct inheritance from the most ruthless, devastating mass extinction event in the 4.5 billion-year history of our planet. The invisible gas that gives you life, the oxygen that powers our modern civilization, is the exact same chemical weapon that mercilessly eradicated 99% of all living entities during the Archean Eon. We are the ultimate children of a planetary apocalypse. We are the complex thinking biological machines that were forged in the toxic fires of the Great Oxidation Event. The oxygen that was once a universal poison slowly transformed over billions of years into the ultimate biological rocket fuel. It allowed the surviving mutated eukaryotic cells to break the microscopic barrier. They evolved into multicellular organisms. They crawled out of the ancient seas. They grew into towering forests. They became massive dinosaurs, shaking the earth with their footsteps, and eventually they became us. Humanity, with our towering cities, our spacefaring technology, and our profound arrogance, is simply the current apex of a biological lineage that learned how to consume the ashes of a ruined world. But as we stand at the pinnacle of the food chain, looking down at the earth, we believe we have conquered. We are blinding ourselves to the most terrifying cosmic paradox of all. We are making the exact same mistake as the cyanobacteria. We look at the ancient microscopic slime that poisoned the Archean atmosphere, and we see primitive, unthinking organisms. We believe we are fundamentally different because we possess consciousness, science, and the ability to look up at the stars and understand our place in the universe. But the cold, unfeeling laws of thermodynamics do not care about our poetry, our art, or our scientific achievements. To the indifferent cosmos, we are just another biological bloom rapidly multiplying on the surface of a tiny, fragile rock. And just like the cyanobacteria, we are blindly, relentlessly altering the chemical composition of our own atmosphere. Instead of oxygen, we are aggressively pumping out colossal quantities of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases, digging up the fossilized remains of ancient life and burning them to fuel our insatiable industrial engines. We are thickening the atmospheric blanket, aggressively trapping the heat of the sun, and fundamentally changing the thermal balance of the entire planet. The cyanobacteria froze the world by destroying the greenhouse effect. We are boiling the world by artificially inflating it. The mechanism is different, but the catastrophic biological arrogance is exactly the same. We are acting as if we are exempt from the brutal cyclical laws of planetary chemistry. We believe that our intelligence will somehow shield us from the physical consequences of our own actions. But the universe has already proven over billions of years that it has absolutely no preference for complex life over microscopic slime. If the atmospheric chemistry changes beyond a certain critical threshold, the cosmic machine will simply reset itself, again sweeping us away just as easily as it swept away the anaerobic lords of the deep. Imagine the sheer scale of the cosmos. Our entire human history, every war fought, every empire built, every technological marvel we have created is nothing more than a microscopic flash in the vast, unfeeling darkness of geological time. The universe has spent over 13 billion years expanding violently, crushing galaxies together and igniting hypernovas that outshine billions of suns. In the grand, terrifying theater of the cosmos, the destruction of a single planetary biosphere is an event so insignificant that it does not even register. The cold, dead vacuum of space does not mourn the passing of a species. The unblinking stars do not weep for the loss of human potential. When we stare up at the night sky, we are not looking at a benevolent canopy. We are looking directly into the face of an absolute crushing apathy. We are a fragile, self-aware anomaly, trapped on a spinning sphere of molten rock, and thin atmospheric gases. Our continued existence is not guaranteed by any divine right or cosmic law. It is a constant, desperate struggle against the overwhelming forces of entropy that seek to tear everything apart and return it to dust. The cyanobacteria, in their blind quest for energy, triggered a planetary apocalypse without a single thought. We, with all our grand intellect and self-proclaimed mastery over nature, are doing exactly the same thing, but with full knowledge of the consequences. That is the true bone-chilling horror of the human condition. We are the only species in the history of the Earth capable of understanding our own impending doom, yet we seem entirely incapable of stopping it. We are speeding toward the precipice fully awake with our eyes wide open. The cosmic irony is absolute. The very intelligence that arose from the ashes of the great oxidation event is now the exact weapon we are using to engineer our own demise. The cycle of the universe is a relentless crushing wheel that grinds down the arrogant and the ignorant alike. We are not separate from nature. We are bound by the exact same physical and chemical laws that eradicated the anaerobic empire. And just like them, if we alter the delicate balance of our planetary life support system, the Earth will simply shrug us off like a mild infection. The blue sky will turn to a suffocating gray, the oceans will rise and boil, and the brief bright candle of human civilization will be violently snuffed out, leaving nothing behind but a thin layer of radioactive dust and plastic polymers buried in the rock. The universe will not notice our absence. But while we are still here, while we still have the breath in our lungs that the cyanobacteria fought so hard to create, we have a choice. We can either succumb to the blind algorithms of destruction, or we can use our unprecedented cosmic awareness to break the cycle. The history of the Earth is a graveyard of failed biological experiments. Do not let humanity be the next layer of forgotten fossils. Nature has never stopped its ruthless cycle of purging. But you do not have to face the existential dread of the universe alone. Next week, we are going to peel back the layers of an even more horrifying planetary mystery, a catastrophic event that literally turned the oceans into boiling acid and nearly erased the concept of a future altogether. It is a story of survival against impossible odds, and it is a stark warning that you absolutely cannot afford to miss. So make sure to subscribe to our channel right now. Turn on the notifications and prepare yourself for another journey into the darkest, most awe-inspiring corners of planetary history. You really do not want to be left behind when the next cosmic truth is revealed.